The moment deputies start locking gates on a luxury resort, somebody has already lost a battle they thought they were winning. The first thing I noticed that morning was the silence. Not complete silence. The kind that feels wrong because something familiar is missing. Usually, before sunrise, the villa complex buzzed with activity. Maintenance carts moved between buildings. Delivery trucks arrived with supplies. Guests walked toward the pool area carrying coffee cups while the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted through the warm Texas air. But on that morning, the only sounds were distant birds, the hum of idling county vehicles, and the metallic click of chains being secured across the entrance gates. Deputies stood beside official notices while workers in reflective vests attached closure signs to fencing surrounding the property. 45 luxury villas sat beyond those gates, perfectly maintained and completely empty. The sunrise painted the rooftops gold while confused guests gathered outside the entrance trying to understand why nobody was being allowed inside. Some people checked their phones. Others argued with staff members who looked just as confused as everyone else. Nobody seemed to have answers. At least not yet. Then a white luxury sport utility vehicle appeared around the corner and accelerated toward the main entrance. It stopped so abruptly that dust rose from the gravel shoulder. The driver's door opened immediately. Deborah Sinclair stepped out looking like someone who had just received the worst phone call of her life. Her expression moved from confusion to disbelief the moment she saw the deputies. She looked at the locked gates. She looked at the notices. Then she looked at the growing crowd gathering around the entrance. "What is this?" she demanded before she even reached the barricade. One deputy calmly pointed toward the court documents displayed near the gate. Deborah barely glanced at them. "No," she said. "No, there has to be a mistake." The deputy remained professional. "Ma'am, these orders came directly from the court." Around her, homeowners, guests, contractors, and employees began whispering. Some recognized Deborah immediately. Others simply knew she was important. She had spent years presenting herself as the person who controlled everything connected to the development. The villas were her pride, her success story, her proof that Harbor Ridge was expanding. Watching her stare at those locked gates felt almost surreal, because standing on a ridge overlooking the entire property, several hundred yards away, I knew exactly why the deputies were there. I knew what the judge had seen. I knew what the surveys revealed. Most importantly, I knew something Deborah had refused to believe for months. The morning breeze carried the smell of cedar and dry grass across my ranch. From where I stood, I could see nearly the entire villa complex spread across the landscape. Stone pathways connected luxury buildings. Decorative fountains reflected the morning sunlight. Palm trees lined the central courtyard. It looked like a place designed by people with unlimited confidence and very little curiosity. Confidence can be expensive when paperwork tells a different story. Deborah continued arguing with the deputies. She pointed toward the villas repeatedly. She referenced permits, investments, community development plans. She talked about years of construction and millions of dollars spent improving the property. Every argument sounded persuasive. None of them changed the documents. The deputies listened patiently before repeating the same answer. The closure was lawful. The order was valid. The site would remain closed pending compliance with the court's ruling. The crowd grew larger by the minute. Confusion spread. Rumors started forming. Nobody seemed capable of understanding how 45 luxury villas could suddenly become the center of a legal disaster. Looking down at the scene from my ranch, I almost understood their disbelief. 6 months earlier, I would have reacted the same way. Because 6 months earlier, I had no idea those villas existed. And I definitely had no idea they were sitting on my land. 6 months earlier, the villa complex was the last thing on my mind. The day I purchased the ranch, I was focused on fences, water rights, grazing leases, and thousands of acres of rolling Texas land stretching farther than I could see from any single hilltop. The property had been owned by the same family for generations before they decided to sell. It came with creeks, hardwood groves, cattle pastures, and enough open space to make a person feel small. That was exactly why I bought it. My name is Wyatt Mercer, and I have spent most of my life around land. Not because I wanted to become rich. Because I genuinely enjoy understanding how properties work. Boundaries matter. History matters. Records matter. Every ranch tells a story if you spend enough time listening. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent long days driving dusty ranch roads in an aging pickup truck, learning where old fences stood and where previous owners had placed water tanks. The smell of cedar trees mixed with dry grass every afternoon. Hawks circled above open fields while cattle moved lazily through shaded areas near the creek. It was the kind of place where a person could drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. Or at least that was what I expected. One afternoon, while exploring the southeastern section of the ranch, I noticed something unusual. At first it seemed insignificant. Fresh tire tracks. Not ranch vehicles. Not construction equipment I recognized. Just enough evidence to suggest regular traffic moving through an area that should have been relatively quiet. I followed the tracks for a while before reaching an old service road shown on several property maps included with the sale. The road itself was not surprising. What surprised me was how well maintained it appeared. Someone had recently graded sections of it. Fresh gravel covered portions of the surface. Nearby vegetation had been trimmed. None of that matched the condition of surrounding ranch infrastructure. Curiosity led me farther down the road. As I drove, I began noticing other details. Utility boxes, decorative lighting, landscaping that looked professionally maintained. The deeper I traveled, the stranger everything became. Then the trees opened, and I caught my first glimpse of Harbor Ridge. Bright rooftops stood above the landscape in the distance. Stone walls reflected sunlight. Decorative fountains sparkled beyond rows of luxury villas. For a moment, I honestly thought I had taken a wrong turn and accidentally crossed on a neighboring property. The development looked completely out of place compared to the rugged ranchland surrounding it. I pulled over and checked my maps. Then I checked them again. According to everything I carried with me, I was still on ranch property. The realization felt impossible. A few days later, I asked several local contractors about the development. Most immediately recognized it. Everyone seemed familiar with the villas. Everyone knew they belonged to Harbor Ridge. Everyone assumed the boundaries had been settled years ago. That assumption became a recurring theme. Whenever I asked questions, people answered with confidence. Nobody answered with documentation. Nobody referenced surveys. Nobody referenced deeds. They simply repeated what they believed to be true. At the time, I accepted those explanations. Why would I not? 45 luxury villas do not simply appear in the wrong place. Large developments require permits, planning, engineering, and investment. The idea that something could be fundamentally wrong never crossed my mind. Looking back now, that was the most dangerous assumption of all. Because while everyone else saw a successful resort development sitting exactly where it belonged, the ranch was quietly preparing to tell a very different story. My first conversation with Deborah Sinclair happened less than 2 weeks after I discovered the villa complex. At the time, I still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation for everything. Large developments do not simply appear without paperwork. Property lines do not accidentally shift hundreds of yards. Somebody somewhere had to possess records that explained why a luxury resort seemed connected to land I had just purchased. The opportunity arrived on a warm Friday afternoon when I attended a local Chamber of Commerce event in town. The gathering took place inside a renovated community center overlooking the river. Ceiling fans rotated slowly above groups of business owners, contractors, real estate agents, and local officials. The smell of barbecue drifted through the building from an outdoor catering area, while people exchanged business cards and discussed upcoming projects. I was speaking with a survey contractor when he pointed across the room. "That is Deborah Sinclair," he said. "She runs Harbor Ridge." I looked toward a woman standing near a display table covered with promotional materials showing villas, walking trails, fountains, and resort amenities. Even from a distance, she projected confidence. People approached her constantly. She greeted each person like someone accustomed to being the most influential voice in the room. A few minutes later, we were introduced. Deborah shook my hand and smiled politely. The moment I mentioned owning the neighboring ranch, her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "So you are the new owner," she said. "I have heard about you." The comment seemed harmless, but something underneath it felt different. During the next several minutes, Deborah spoke extensively about Harbor Ridge. She described future expansion plans, community investments, tourism opportunities, and infrastructure improvements. Listening to her, a person would assume the development controlled half the county. Every statement carried certainty. Every plan sounded permanent. Eventually, I asked a simple question about the villas near the ranch boundary. Deborah laughed softly. "Those villas have been there for years," she said. "Everything has already been settled." Settled. Another interesting word. I asked whether surveys existed confirming the boundaries. She immediately replied that Harbor Ridge had operated successfully for a long time, and that nobody had ever questioned the location before. That answer surprised me. Not because it was wrong, because it completely ignored the question. Throughout my career, I learned that people with strong documentation usually reference documentation. People relying on assumptions tend to reference history, reputation, and confidence. As the conversation continued, Deborah repeatedly referred to the surrounding area as part of the Harbor Ridge ecosystem. She discussed roads, utilities, landscaping corridors, and future projects extending well beyond the visible resort property. The more she spoke, the more I noticed a pattern. She treated proximity as ownership. If something benefited Harbor Ridge, she seemed to believe Harbor Ridge possessed some degree of authority over it. Before leaving, she handed me a glossy brochure displaying aerial photographs of the development. The villas looked impressive. Stone courtyards, luxury accommodations, resort pools, decorative lakes. Everything appeared professionally designed and extremely expensive. Driving back to the ranch that evening, I found myself thinking less about the buildings and more about Deborah's confidence. She never once mentioned deeds. She never once mentioned surveys. She never once mentioned legal descriptions. Yet she spoke with absolute certainty. Looking back now, that conversation marked the beginning of the entire conflict. Because while Deborah believed she was reassuring a neighboring landowner, she accidentally convinced me that the one thing nobody had bothered to verify was the one thing that mattered most. For the next several weeks, I paid closer attention to the southeastern section of the ranch than any other area on the property. What started as mild curiosity slowly became something else. Every time I drove near the resort development, I noticed details that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. The first thing was the traffic. Maintenance vehicles moved in and out almost daily. Landscaping crews arrived before sunrise. Supply trucks delivered materials several times a week. None of that was unusual for a luxury villa complex. What was unusual was where some of those vehicles were traveling. Several access routes appeared to cross portions of land that my ranch maps identified as private property. One morning, while checking water infrastructure near an old creek crossing, I discovered freshly installed directional signs. The signs carried Harbor Ridge branding and pointed visitors toward resort amenities. I stood there for several seconds staring at them. The signs were professionally made, decorative, permanent. They looked as though they had been installed with complete confidence that nobody would ever question their placement. The smell of damp earth lingered in the air from a storm the night before. Birds moved through the trees overhead, while sunlight reflected off the polished metal signs. The entire scene felt strangely symbolic. Harbor Ridge seemed to be expanding outward one small assumption at a time. A few days later, I noticed utility contractors working near a tree line separating part of the development from ranch property. Curious, I stopped to speak with them. The workers were friendly enough. Most assumed they were operating entirely within resort boundaries. When I asked who authorized the work, they immediately referenced Harbor Ridge management. Nobody mentioned surveys. Nobody mentioned property records. Once again, everyone seemed to be relying on assumptions. Around the same time, I received a letter from Harbor Ridge requesting cooperation regarding future access improvements. The wording was polite, but the message underneath it was clear. Deborah viewed the surrounding area as part of the development's long-term plans. Reading the letter while sitting on my porch one evening, I found myself increasingly interested in one simple question. How much of Harbor Ridge's confidence was actually supported by documentation? The question followed me everywhere. During meetings with contractors, during conversations with neighboring landowners, even during routine ranch inspections. The more I listened, the more I realized something surprising. Nobody seemed capable of explaining where the actual boundary lines were located. People referenced landmarks, roads, fences, trees. They referenced what they had always been told. Very few referenced recorded surveys. Then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, I met with a fencing contractor to discuss repairs along an aging section of ranch boundary. The contractor suggested verifying several corners before beginning work. It sounded reasonable, so I hired a survey crew to review the area. The The decision felt completely routine at the time. Surveyors verify boundaries every day. Most of the time, nothing interesting happens. A week later, I accompanied the crew into the field. The smell of cedar mixed with fresh-cut brush as workers searched for historical markers hidden beneath decades of vegetation. Hours passed without incident. Then one of the surveyors called the rest of us over. Partially buried beneath roots and soil sat an old marker matching records from earlier property descriptions. Additional measurements followed. More markers were located. More calculations were performed. I watched the survey crew exchange increasingly serious looks. Nobody wanted to jump to conclusions. Professionals rarely do. Still, the atmosphere changed noticeably. By late afternoon, the lead surveyor approached me carrying a field notebook filled with measurements. He spoke carefully, choosing every word with obvious caution. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "there is a boundary line here that does not appear to match what a lot of people think." Standing there beneath the fading Texas sunlight, looking toward the distant villas beyond the trees, I suddenly had the feeling that Harbor Ridge was about to become much more complicated than anyone expected. The survey crew returned twice more during the following month. What began as a simple boundary verification slowly transformed into a much larger investigation. Every new measurement raised additional questions. Every newly discovered marker seemed to point toward the same uncomfortable possibility. I spent more time with surveyors during those weeks than I had with some friends. Most mornings began before sunrise. The smell of coffee mixed with cedar trees while trucks carrying equipment bounced along old ranch roads. The surveyors moved carefully through brush, creek beds, and fence lines searching for evidence left behind by previous generations. Property boundaries are like puzzles. The answers already exist. The challenge is finding enough pieces to see the complete picture. One morning, we stood beneath a cluster of oak trees overlooking part of the villa complex. The lead surveyor spread maps across the tailgate of his truck. Wind moved through the grass, while distant maintenance crews worked around the resort. Looking at the documents, I noticed something unusual. Several historical references aligned in ways nobody expected. Modern assumptions and older records appeared to be telling different stories. The surveyor explained that additional research would be necessary before any conclusions could be reached. He remained cautious. Professionals always do. Yet even his caution could not hide growing concern. Around the same time, I started examining documents included with the ranch purchase more closely. Boxes of records filled an office inside the main ranch house. Old deeds, property descriptions, survey plats, transfer documents. Some papers were decades old. Others reached back even farther. Most people would consider the process unbearably boring. I found it fascinating. The smell of aging paper filled the room as I spent evening after evening reviewing property history. Patterns slowly emerged. References connected to other references. Boundary descriptions linked together across generations of ownership. Then one evening, I found something interesting. A legal description from many years earlier appeared to place a key boundary in a location that conflicted with common local assumptions. Alone, the document meant very little. Combined with the survey findings, however, it became far more significant. I contacted a title specialist recommended by one of the surveyors. Several days later, we met in a conference room filled with maps and ownership records. The specialist reviewed chain of title documents connected to the ranch and surrounding properties. Hours passed as we followed ownership transfers through multiple decades. Every transaction added another layer to the story. By the end of the meeting, one thing had become clear. Nobody could simply rely on what people believed. The records needed a full review. While all of this was happening, Harbor Ridge continued operating as though nothing was unusual. Guests arrived daily. Landscaping crews maintained the grounds. Promotional materials advertised luxury accommodations and future improvements. Deborah appeared at community events discussing expansion plans and long-term investments. The confidence never changed. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. That confidence became even more interesting when a certified letter arrived at my ranch. Harbor Ridge claimed I was interfering with community planning efforts near the resort. The accusation surprised me because I had done almost nothing beyond reviewing my own property records. The letter was professionally written, but the tone was unmistakable. Deborah wanted me to stop asking questions. Instead, the letter accomplished the opposite. It convinced me the questions were probably important. A few weeks later, the survey crew completed another phase of their work. We met beside a series of markers recently verified through multiple measurements. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, while resort buildings stood visible beyond the tree line. The lead surveyor looked more serious than I had ever seen him. He reviewed several findings before pausing. Then he pointed toward the villas. "Mr. Mercer," he said quietly, "if the remaining records support what we are seeing here, the implications are going to be very significant." Standing there looking toward those 45 luxury villas, I had the unmistakable feeling that Harbor Ridge was much closer to a legal problem than anyone inside the resort realized. The breakthrough arrived on a rainy Wednesday afternoon inside a county archive building that smelled like dust, paper, and old wood. For months, every road seemed to lead toward the same question. Now, for the first time, it felt like we were finally approaching an answer. I sat across from the title specialist while stacks of historical records covered a conference table. Survey plats, ownership transfers, boundary descriptions, easement filings. Decades of documentation stretched across the room like pieces of a giant puzzle. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows while fluorescent lights reflected off plastic document sleeves. Nobody spoke much. We were all focused on the records. One by one, the remaining gaps in the ownership chain began disappearing. A transfer connected to another transfer. A survey reference aligned with a recorded plat. A boundary description matched physical markers recently located by the survey crew. Every independent source pointed in the same direction. The title specialist eventually leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. His reaction told me everything before he even spoke. "The documentation is remarkably consistent," he said. "Much more consistent than I expected." He slid several copies toward me. The legal descriptions were detailed, technical, and impossible to misunderstand once explained. The ranch boundaries described decades earlier matched the boundaries supported by modern survey work. More importantly, they matched the location of the resort development. I stared at the maps for several seconds. The implications were enormous. The 45 villas were not sitting near the ranch. They were not partially overlapping the ranch. According to the growing body of evidence, the villas appeared to be located entirely within property connected to the ownership chain I had purchased. Even then, I remained cautious. Discoveries are exciting. Verification matters more. During the following weeks, additional professionals reviewed the findings independently. County mapping personnel examined the records. Survey consultants reviewed calculations. Attorneys analyzed ownership history. Nobody seemed eager to make dramatic claims. That actually increased my confidence. Professionals become careful when evidence is strong. They know accuracy matters more than speed. Meanwhile, Harbor Ridge continued operating exactly as before. New promotional materials appeared online. Reservations continued. Landscaping improvements expanded around the property. Deborah attended community events discussing future plans and long-term growth. Watching it happen felt increasingly surreal. The closer the documentation moved towards certainty, the more confidently Harbor Ridge behaved as though no questions existed. Then everything changed because of a letter. Not a survey, not a court order. A letter. One morning, a process server arrived at the ranch. The envelope he delivered contained a lawsuit filed by Deborah and Harbor Ridge. I read the complaint twice because I genuinely thought I had misunderstood it the first time. The development claimed I was interfering with business operations and creating uncertainty regarding property interests. The accusation would have been almost amusing if the consequences were not so serious. Deborah had officially transformed a property question into a legal dispute. The moment I finished reading the paperwork, I realized she had made a mistake. A very expensive mistake. Lawsuits require evidence. Evidence requires records. Records require scrutiny. Everything Harbor Ridge had spent years assuming was now about to be examined under a microscope. My attorneys reviewed the filing that same afternoon. The smell of coffee filled the conference room while copies of surveys and title reports covered the table. Nobody appeared worried. In fact, several people seemed surprised the lawsuit had arrived before the ownership questions were resolved. One attorney finally looked up from the documents and shook his head. "If they really want this examined in court," he said, "they may not like where it leads." As evening settled across the ranch, I stood on a hill overlooking the distant villas. Lights glowed from windows throughout the development. Guests walked between buildings completely unaware of the legal storm gathering around them. Deborah believed she was forcing me into a corner. In reality, she had just opened the door to the one place where assumptions mean nothing and documentation means everything. The legal process moved much faster after the lawsuit was filed. What Deborah expected to be a straightforward pressure tactic quickly became something far more dangerous for Harbor Ridge. Courts have a way of stripping away assumptions and forcing everyone back to the same starting point. Documentation, evidence, records. Opinions become less important when survey plats, deeds, and ownership chains start appearing on conference tables. Within weeks, attorneys on both sides were exchanging documents. Experts were retained. Additional surveys were reviewed. Historical records were requested from county archives. Every step added another layer of scrutiny. Every layer seemed to reveal the same thing. I spent several afternoons inside conference rooms surrounded by maps large enough to cover entire walls. Survey overlays displayed property boundaries in bright colors. Historical plats were compared against modern aerial photography. Engineers reviewed infrastructure layouts. Title specialists traced ownership transfers stretching back decades. The smell of coffee and printer toner became strangely familiar. Some meetings lasted hours. Others lasted entire days. Yet no matter how much information was examined, the conclusions continued moving in the same direction. Harbor Ridge had relied on assumptions. The records relied on something else. During one particularly important review session, a county mapping specialist presented findings that drew immediate attention from everyone in the room. Using historical surveys, modern satellite imagery, and recorded legal descriptions, he demonstrated how the boundaries aligned across multiple generations of ownership. The presentation was methodical and unemotional. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. Watching the room react was fascinating. Attorneys took notes. Surveyors nodded. Engineers asked technical questions. Every answer seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. Meanwhile, Deborah continued projecting confidence publicly. Harbor Ridge newsletters discussed future projects. Community meetings focused on expansion opportunities. Promotional materials continued advertising the villas as though nothing unusual was happening behind the scenes. The contrast became almost surreal. Inside legal proceedings, ownership questions were becoming increasingly serious. Outside, the development behaved as though victory was guaranteed. Then came the expert reports. Independent professionals completed their reviews and submitted formal findings. Survey data, boundary analysis, ownership history, infrastructure placement. Each report approached the issue from a different angle. Yet the results remained remarkably consistent. My attorneys organized everything into comprehensive presentations designed for court review. One afternoon, I walked into their office and saw an entire wall covered with maps, diagrams, timelines, and property records. Looking at it all together felt different than reviewing individual pieces. For the first time, the full picture became impossible to ignore. The villas were not simply near the ranch. They were not partially crossing a disputed boundary. The evidence increasingly suggested that the development existed on land connected to the ownership rights acquired with the ranch purchase. As the hearing date approached, the atmosphere around Harbor Ridge began changing. Rumors spread. Residents started asking questions. Investors wanted updates. Contractors became cautious. Even people with no direct involvement seemed aware that something significant was unfolding. Deborah responded by becoming more aggressive. Additional legal filings appeared. Public statements grew more confident. Yet every new action seemed to create additional opportunities for records to be examined. Additional scrutiny only strengthened the documentation already being reviewed. Several days before the most important hearing, I stood on a hill overlooking the illuminated villas. Evening sunlight reflected from windows throughout the resort, while guests moved through courtyards completely unaware of the legal arguments surrounding the property beneath their feet. The scene looked peaceful, successful, permanent. Yet I knew something they did not. The judge was about to review the complete record. The surveys, the title history, the expert findings, the county documentation. Months of investigation were about to converge in one place. And if the evidence carried the same weight in court that it had carried everywhere else, Harbor Ridge was about to discover that confidence is no substitute for ownership. The hearing itself was far less dramatic than most people imagine. There were no surprise witnesses, no emotional speeches, and no theatrical moments. The most powerful thing in the courtroom was a stack of documents. Survey plats, county records, historical deeds, expert reports, ownership chains. Months of investigation sat neatly organized on tables, while attorneys presented findings that had already been reviewed countless times. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, while people quietly took notes. Deborah sat with her legal team projecting confidence, but for the first time since I had met her, the certainty seemed forced. She knew the same evidence we knew. She had seen the same reports. The difference was that she still appeared to believe something would somehow change at the last moment. It never did. One expert after another explained how the boundaries had been verified. Survey markers located in the field matched recorded descriptions. Historical plats aligned with modern mapping. Ownership transfers connected through decades of documentation without interruption. Every path led to the same destination. The land beneath the villas belonged to the ranch. The judge listened carefully throughout the proceedings. Questions were asked. Clarifications were requested. Additional records were reviewed. The process was methodical and professional. That was what made it so devastating for Harbor Ridge. There was no single piece of evidence to attack because the conclusion did not depend on one piece of evidence. It depended on all of them. The survey supported the deeds. The deeds supported the title history. The title history supported the county records. Everything reinforced everything else. By the time the final presentations concluded, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed noticeably. Even people with no direct involvement seemed to understand where the evidence was leading. Deborah's attorneys continued arguing their position, emphasizing years of operation, investment, development, and community reliance. Those points were understandable. The problem was that none of them changed ownership. Improvements do not create title. Assumptions do not create title. Confidence does not create title. Records create title. Several weeks later, the ruling arrived. I was sitting on the porch of the ranch house when my attorney called. The afternoon air carried the smell of cedar and sun-baked grass across the property. Cattle moved through a distant pasture, while a light breeze rustled leaves in nearby trees. The moment I heard his voice, I knew the decision had been issued. The judge's findings were extensive. The court accepted the documentation supporting ownership. The surveys were validated. The title history was recognized. The property rights connected to the ranch were confirmed. More importantly, the court authorized enforcement measures regarding the resort site pending compliance with the ruling. The news spread quickly, faster than I expected. Within days, county officials coordinated implementation procedures. Notices were prepared. Timelines were established. Administrative requirements were outlined. Everything followed a formal process. Nobody rushed. Nobody improvised. Every step occurred exactly as required. Then came the morning that people would talk about for years. Deputies arrived before sunrise. County representatives arrived shortly afterward. Official notices were posted at entrances throughout the development. Access points were secured. Operations were suspended pending compliance with court directives. Guests were redirected. Contractors were informed. Managers were briefed. The entire process remained orderly, professional, and remarkably calm. Yet the impact was enormous. Standing on the ridge overlooking the villas, watching county vehicles move through the property beneath a golden sunrise, I thought about the first survey marker we discovered months earlier. A small piece of metal hidden beneath roots and dirt had started a chain of events nobody could have predicted. Deborah believed a lawsuit would force me to stop asking questions. Instead, it forced every question to be answered. And as the last notice was attached to the entrance gate and the final county vehicle pulled into position, the truth that had been buried beneath years of assumptions finally became impossible for anyone to ignore. The months that followed felt strangely peaceful compared to everything that came before. Once the court's ruling had been implemented and the site was no longer operating under its previous arrangement, the constant uncertainty finally disappeared. Questions that had lingered for months now had answers. Ownership had been clarified. Boundaries had been confirmed. Records had been verified. The arguments stopped because there was nothing left to argue about. Facts tend to have that effect. One crisp autumn morning, I drove across the ranch before sunrise. The air smelled of cedar and dry grass. A thin layer of mist hung over the low fields while cattle moved quietly near a creek crossing. For the first time in nearly a year, I found myself thinking less about surveys and court filings and more about the ranch itself. That was all I had wanted from the beginning. I never purchased the property looking for a legal battle. I bought it because I loved the land. Looking across thousands of acres illuminated by early morning light, I felt grateful that the truth had eventually surfaced, even if the path there had been far more complicated than anyone expected. Harbor Ridge changed as well. New leadership gradually emerged. Community meetings became less focused on expansion and more focused on transparency. Residents demanded documentation where assumptions had once been accepted. Future projects required greater oversight. Conversations that once centered on confidence now centered on records. In a strange way, the entire situation forced everyone to become more careful. Even people who had initially supported Deborah began acknowledging that too many decisions had been made based on what people believed rather than what the documents actually showed. I saw Deborah only once after everything concluded. The encounter happened during a county planning meeting several months later. She looked tired. Not angry. Not defeated. Simply quieter than before. The confidence that had defined nearly every previous interaction seemed replaced by caution. We exchanged a brief greeting and nothing more. There was no dramatic confrontation. No final argument. No victory speech. The dispute had already been settled where it mattered. Everything else would have been unnecessary. Over time, formal agreements were negotiated regarding future use and compliance requirements connected to the property. Attorneys handled details. Surveyors finalized documentation. County officials completed administrative reviews. The process lacked drama, but that was exactly how it should have been. Real solutions rarely arrive through dramatic moments. They arrive through paperwork, signatures, and people finally accepting reality. One evening, nearly a year after I first noticed those unusual tire tracks near the southeastern boundary, I stood on a ridge overlooking the ranch as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The sky glowed orange and gold. Long shadows stretched across the fields. In the distance, the former villa site sat quietly beneath the fading light. Looking at it from that vantage point, it was hard to believe how much had changed because of a single decision to verify a boundary line. A survey marker hidden beneath roots. A deed stored in an archive. A property description written decades earlier. Small details most people would never notice had ultimately determined the outcome of an entire development. That lesson stayed with me. Land remembers everything. Records remember everything. People often build stories around assumptions because assumptions are convenient. The truth is usually buried in documents nobody bothers to read until circumstances force them to look. As darkness settled across the ranch and the first stars appeared overhead, I thought about the morning deputies arrived at the site. At the time, many people saw it as the end of a story. They were wrong. It was simply the moment reality finally caught up with paperwork. The real story had started decades earlier when boundaries were recorded and ownership was documented. Everything that happened afterward was merely the consequence of ignoring those facts. Standing there in the quiet Texas evening, watching the land stretch toward the horizon, I felt a sense of closure that had nothing to do with winning. The ranch was still there. The records were still there. The truth was still there. It had been there the entire time, patiently waiting for someone to pay attention.